It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Claire Coutinho, The Telegraph's chief political correspondent Chris Hope, Labour MP Clive Lewis and Observer writer Sonia Soda. Today,
we wouldn't have been having the matches that have taken place if we hadn't allowed players and associated team members to come in for that purpose.
Thousands of football VIPs will be allowed to attend the Euro semi-finals and final at Wembley without quarantine. Is this right?
Everyone who wants to go to the UK has to go into quarantine for 14 days, and there are only very few exceptions for this.
We'll bring you Prime Minister's questions live at noon. Also,
Two carriages full, people can't get on, people can't sit down, they're overheated, they leak.
is the new rail line between Leeds and Manchester caught up in the spending wars between Number 10 and the Treasury? And is the division from the Brexit vote still driving our politics 5 years on?
This does not mean that the United Kingdom will be in any way less united.
Let's start with the story you heard there in the headlines by showing you this in the Daily Telegraph. Exclusive: government accused of hypocrisy as football VIPs allowed to visit UK without quarantine. And Tory MPs have hit out about it, some of them anyway, the fact that VIPs will be exempt from self-isolation even though they're flying into the UK from abroad, so they won't be subject to quarantine requirements that apply to other international travellers. Is that exemption fair, Claire?
Well, I think the important thing to remember here is, firstly, it's a limited number of people, and actually they still face significant restrictions when they come here. So when they come, they're allowed to go to the place that they're staying. They can then go to the match. They have to go back after that to the place that they're staying. And they also have to show proof that they've been doubly vaccinated and also or they've been tested. So there's a significant amount of restrictions on these people coming in.
Right, you say it's a limited number. I understand, or it's reported, it could be up to 2,500 VIPs. Does that worry you?
Well, I think in the grand scheme of things, that is quite a small number. And as I said, they're still facing restrictions when they get here.
Clive, is it fair?
It doesn't seem like it, does it, really? I mean, I know there are exceptions. No one expected Joe Biden or Angela Merkel to go into 2 weeks of isolation when they came here for the G7. But I think it's sheer scale, the numbers of people that are coming in. And I also think it's not just whether they've been vaccinated, whether they've been tested. If they are carriers of COVID, then potentially it's the staff at the functions they'll be attending at Wembley, at the hotels that they'll be staying in that I'm thinking about. And clearly that's putting them at risk. They may not have had their 2 jabs. So I think it is difficult. I understand we want this to go smoothly. We want the football games to be enjoyed. But I am questioning whether we need that size gravy train coming here and jeopardising, many people, including workers in those industries that will be supporting and providing hospitality. I'm not so sure it's a great idea. And I think to many people out there who are looking at this, I think they may think it's a double standard. Right.
Chris, there is another issue which is also increasing the number of people in the stadium. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, mentioned that too when she was interviewed. She's worried about the numbers. I think they're going up to something like 60,000 in a 90,000 capacity stadium. Excuse if I haven't got the figures precisely right. Is it justified?
Well, I think it is. I think this is politics in the raw. I mean, Boris Johnson knows that football is a good vote winner, and having a big stuffed Wembley ahead of these big games is really important in terms of lifting the mood. And I think that I think people will think, well, given most people have been double vaccinated, then it shouldn't be that bad. I think people are overreacting slightly. There is a risk here, though, about confidence in it when it's one rule for the others and one rule for the population. We saw that with the G7 party in Cornwall. That might be a concern that you have this VIP special treatment, and that might weaken support for the lockdown restrictions, but hopefully we're on the way out, and there might be news tomorrow on the amber list countries anyway, which could make this less important.
And there have been big events piloted, haven't there, Sonia, in terms of allowing people to attend anything from sports events to some concerts, and understanding the Wimbledon final might also have increased capacity. But what do you think on this issue? Is it fair?
I don't think it's fair in the sense I don't think it sends out the right message. So I think in terms of the actual risk posed, I think what's very interesting is you had John Edmonds from Sage say in regards to 2,500 people, VIPs that might be coming in, they probably don't pose that much of a substantive risk. But I think it's, as Chris says, it's more about the issue it sends to people about whether the system's fair, whether it sort of starts to bake down trust and people's levels of compliance with regulations. And I do think that, I completely agree. We should be piloting events, mass events, and checking, keeping a very close eye on whether they're spread. But I don't think it makes that much difference whether there was, 25,000 fans in Wembley or 90,000 fans in Wembley. So I am a bit worried that UEFA, an international sporting body, has put undue pressure on the government because of its threat to move the competition, the final, to Hungary instead.
Let's talk about this. Another headline from your paper, Chris. Government accused... Oh, no, that's the one I've just read. It's a different one, but it is still from the Telegraph. It says, Northern Powerhouse Rail, Treasury accused of scaling down £40 billion scheme to cut costs. There it is. Read it first, Joe, before you actually read it out loud. Now, this is a plan that was originally announced by George Osborne when he was Chancellor to boost rail links between key northern cities like Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds and Hull, including with some new high-speed rail lines. Now, there was a commitment to the Northern Powerhouse Rail in the last Conservative manifesto at the general election in 2019. But today, as we can see, not just in the Telegraph, but reports that the Treasury wants to scale back the project because of concerns about how much it might cost. Let's speak to Henry Morrison from the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. Hello to you, Henry. Are you concerned about these reports?
I think, like any rumours like this, it's obviously unsettling for the business community, who are very keen to see these improved links across the Pennines. It's going to underpin a lot of investment from the private sector as well in cities like Leeds, Bradford, Manchester, on to Liverpool. So I think that there's always going to be lots of concerns when rumours like this emerge. But we have seen the Prime Minister being very clear that absolutely this is going to happen. I think the spokesperson said it yesterday, went much further than they've gone in the past. So we are to an extent reassured by the government making that renewed political commitment. But in the end, there isn't yet a plan published for HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail in the north. That was supposed to come some weeks ago now, and we do need to see that integrated rail plan before the summer recess.
Right, and how important is it? I mean, obviously the Treasury is thinking about the COVID recovery and how it's all going to be paid for and whether it's affordable.
I think that the challenge in the north of England is that although the government and Grant Shapps is very welcome in spending money as he is on the existing line between Leeds and Manchester, this is infrastructure that's 150-year-old. This is tunnels that you almost can't improve, right, because they're so old, you can't do much work to them. So there's only so many trains an hour you can run between Leeds and Manchester. And that means whether you're going to the Premiership football on the weekend or you're trying to commute to work from Newcastle or Middlesbrough across to Liverpool or Manchester, there just aren't enough seats for people in the north of England to commute distances, which in London, the south east, I mean, Leeds to Manchester is the equivalent of the central line. So people cannot commute those sort of journeys in the same way. And that massively inhibits the economy. So Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, is probably one of the most long-standing supporters of this, other than George Osborne. He's been a huge fan of this since he first entered Parliament. So I think we've got a lot of support within Conservative MPs. We've also got a lot of support from those Labour Metro mayors and civic leaders and from the business community. So it's one of those projects that uniquely has almost universal political backing and has a very strong economic case. And there isn't any basis under which the pandemic, you aren't still going to need to level up the country. You're going to still need to close that north-south divide.
All right, well,
and it's very hard to see how we'll do it without this project.
All right, well, Henry, stay with us. I mean, Claire, you work closely with Rishi Sunak. There are reports of delays. We also know there are reports of rows and discussions between number 10 and number 11, twas ever thus, you could say, when it comes to splashing the cash, which the Prime Minister has been accused of. Is this where the rhetoric about levelling up, as the Prime Minister always says, is hitting and actually the reality of delivering it?
No, so I mean, I would say that the media do love to talk about rows between number 10 and number 11, but actually those conversations are completely normal. I mean, they've been happening for hundreds of years.
So they are talking about...
What you want to have is a Prime Minister with an ambitious agenda, and you want to have a Chancellor who's got an eye on sustainable public finances. That's the way those conversations are meant to work.
Is it going to be delayed?
And what I would say, well, I mean, I think, as Henry mentioned, what you're talking about is rumour, and you'll appreciate that I can't really comment on what's been speculated in the press. But what you'll have seen from the last 2 years by this duo is, two people who have been committed to the manifesto pledges, have been investing in things like excellent public services, have been investing in our net zero ambitions, investing in levelling up at the country. And that's why they're, I think, such a strong political, powerful force.
Yeah, but commitment is one thing. And as I say, rhetoric is too. But perhaps delivering it is going to be far, far more difficult.
Well, exactly. We're looking into a comprehensive spending review, which Claire knows all about from her past life, this autumn, a 3-year spending agreement. We saw Channel 4 could be sold off. This is another kind of issue where the Treasury is trying to claw money back for the finances. I think I can entirely agree with Henry there. I mean, this is obviously a key part of levelling up, and Rishi Sunak must get that given his Yorkshire constituency. So I can't believe that this will be rowed back on. If it is, it's bad news for this whole idea, the whole point of Boris Johnson's premiership.
Right. I mean, Clive, obviously decisions and priorities have got to be made. And this was part of the reason the Conservatives would argue that Boris Johnson succeeded in many of those seats that were formerly part of Labour's Red Wall. We don't know, obviously categorically, that it's going to be delayed. But this is going to be obviously key generally to the post-COVID recovery.
Yeah, completely. And look, I mean, in terms of what we can afford to do, we can afford to do what the productive economy productive capacity of our economy is. We're a sovereign currency. And therefore, look, we were told that, hundreds of billions of pounds weren't available for example, fighting an existential threat of the climate crisis. But along comes the pandemic and we found the money. So I think one of the things that COVID has done, it's shown that when we need to find the money to do things, we can do it. It's like Keynes said, we can afford to do what we need to do. And we need to find more money to invest, not just in infrastructure, which is what the levelling up agenda seems to increasingly be about, although that's important. We know there are almost 2 million jobs at permanent risk of loss from the long-term impacts of COVID-19, but we also need to be investing in the infrastructure, human and physical, for the oncoming climate crisis. So we know that £20 billion spent in social care, in the care sector, could create 600,000 massive green jobs into the future. So look, at the end of the day, I'm not going to buy into the narrative that we have to kind of cut our cloth accordingly, tighten our belt. We're facing an existential crisis from the climate and ecological collapse, the post-pandemic. And, this is the new normal. Pandemics like this, we don't know what's going to happen in terms of the COVID mutating in other parts of the world. We have to put ourselves on a footing so we're prepared for the systemic shocks that most people in government, I know this, know are coming this century. So talking about, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak wants to go back to a Thatcherite ideology, what we saw under the last 10 years of austerity. It isn't an option anymore. So I think politicians and politics need to get real to that. The public are way ahead of the curve on this.
Right. Do we have to cut our cloth, Claire?
Well, look, I'm not going to take any lessons on the economy from someone who backs a 4-day working week and universal basic income. But what I will actually agree with Clive on is that this is about the productive capacity of the economy and it's about jobs. And if you look at the work that we've done in the Treasury and the results from that, we've seen 5 months of payroll additions. We've seen the lowest unemployment rate out of any major economy and 2 million people, fewer people out of work. So, I mean, that's what we've been focused on and that's what we've been delivering.
Right. Well, I mean, Lord Heseltine, Conservative Cabinet Minister in the 80s and 90s, has told the BBC, though, today that levelling up has no strategy or coherence behind it. Do you accept that, Claire?
No, I don't think that's right at all, actually. I think what you've seen is a really powerful combination of us investing in education, in public services, us investing in infrastructure, improving connectivity, investing in broadband. These are all the different things that people have been talking about for years that we need to do for the country, and that's what we're getting on with.
Right. I mean, Clive, is Labour under Keir Starmer committed to infrastructure, building new high-speed rail lines between northern cities?
So committed to, as I understand it, our manifesto, Ed Miliband has made an announcement. We've committed to £30 billion on green infrastructure, on preparing for what he's called the Green New Deal. I would say that's still not enough. If you look at what's happened over in the US, Joe Biden spent around about 1.9 trillion, or he's pledged 1.9 trillion. Let's see if it goes through Congress and Senate. But that's what he's pledged. That's around about 9% of their GDP, 8% of their GDP, sorry. According to the IPPR here in the UK, this government has pledged at most around about 4% of GDP. People are commenting and critiquing the 8% that Joe Biden is promising is too little. And so we're way behind the curve on what needs to happen. And so far from this government, we're getting greenwash. Even the Climate Change Committee are now openly coming out with a former Conservative as chair, slandering the government, telling them that they're simply not doing enough. And I'm sure the minister here will reel off a long list of things they've done. Simply put, it's not enough, given the scale of the crisis in front of us.
All right, well, let's talk about some other expensive items that have been promised in manifestos. Many MPs are worried about the public finances in general. In fact, this week, 3 MPs have come on to Politics Live and said the government should at least discuss scrapping the so-called pensions triple lock, which was also in the Conservative manifesto. Let's take a look.
We need to have a look at the triple lock. We can't always rely on those young working people paying ever more tax with ever less benefit, with ever less security for their futures.
We've got to be really serious about where the big bucks go, and I'm afraid the pensions triple lock, particularly in the context of the earnings figures, should really be on the table for discussion.
Why should those who have their incomes guaranteed, pensioners, benefit to the tune of 6% because of the anomaly of the bounce back?
Well, times they have changed, Claire, and obviously this is the commitment that pensions should go up either by inflation or earnings or 2.5%, whichever is highest. Can we still afford the triple lock?
Well, I mean, that's the government policy. And, you know, there's lots of things that we're going to have to look at this year in the spending review, in the budget. That's how fiscal events work. And that's what governments have to do. We have to look at the things that we promised and we have to look at how we can afford them.
Right. Sonia, Siobhan McDonough was one of the MPs there, Labour MP, who also said it needs to be debated. Are you surprised by the shift?
I'm not really, because I think when you look at the sort of deal that young people are getting at the moment, young working age people, it's been really, really harsh. And there have been very generous increases in pensions as a result of the pensions triple lock in recent years. So I do think it's right that it's looked again. I don't think it's right that government spending should continue to shift disproportionately towards people who are retired. But I do think it's a question of priorities as well. If you look at the last decade, working age benefits, so that's tax credits for low-paid parents, have been cut by thousands of pounds a year for some families, at the same time as Conservative chancellors have cut income tax to the tune of £1 billion a year, corporation tax to the tune of £1 billion a year. So this isn't just about what's in our budget and what we can spend and can't spend. It's a matter of priorities. And Conservative governments have, for the last 10 years, choose to prioritise tax cuts for the more affluent at the expense of parents, working low-paid parents who have lost out on a lot of support.
Chris?
Well, yes, but it is actually a major Tory manifesto pledge, and Lib Dems remember how the trouble that they got over student fees. I would say though that it could be part of dealing with social care. I think the social care issue we'll see a white paper maybe this year, and if you can try and offer more support to old people with care and balance that off against some agreement on dealing with this, it could be a way of squaring it with the core vote, but it will be a problem if they do go back on it.
Right. It could be a problem, but is the manifesto up for grabs and the commitments made in it?
I mean, I think everything you've seen from people around the cabinet table over the last 2 years is people who have been delivering on the manifesto pledges. I know the Institute for Government did an analysis at some point and said that we delivered about 50% of our pledges so far, despite having an unprecedented pandemic. So, no, I think there's a huge amount of commitment to those pledges.
All right, well, let's talk about a progressive alliance. And actually, before we do, let me thank Henry Morrison, who has been sitting there patiently. I'm sorry I didn't come back to you in the end, but I hope you found it interesting. This progressive alliance we're going to talk about, the idea that parties on the Liberal left, Labour, the Lib Dems and Greens, could work together against the Conservatives. It's something that Clive Lewis has written about. Let me just show you the headline in the Guardian newspaper. To beat the Tories, we must first join forces to beat the electoral system. And it's with Caroline Lucas from the Greens, Layla Moran from the Lib Dems and Clive Lewis, our guest today, for the Labour Party. Why is it a good idea, Clive?
Because it's simply put, if you look at what the Conservatives have done, is they have managed to morph and merge, whether it's with the Liberals and Liberal opinion, whether it's with UKIP, and absorb them and become the dominant party in this country, whilst parties of the centre and the left basically fragment in ever increasing numbers and can't respond to that. And that's why in the last century, the Tories are able to win 3 times as many elections as the Labour Party. It's why they're on course to win even more, as well as gerrymandering and suppressing democratic rights in this country as one of the most authoritarian governments we've seen in living memory. So this is just about other political parties, non-Tory parties, centre-left parties, operating, and movements. It's not just about parties. And one of the things I wanted to say here, I think sometimes we get the wrong impression, this isn't about some kind of 1997 backroom deal between Paddy Ashdown and Tony Blair. This is organic. It's already happening across the country, in town halls, city halls across the country, in local authorities. It's happening from the ground up. Leaders in political parties can give direction, they can give leadership, they can give encouragement. But this is going to come from the bottom up. It needs to be flexible, it needs to be modern, it needs to be adaptive. It isn't one size fits all. It isn't some party leader pulling a lever and making things happen. But it has to be integral across the board, from the bottom up and the top down. So I think it's a fantastic idea, and I think if we look at what's happening in politics, we need it.
I think we've got the idea. You think it's a good way forward, and you're calling it the Progressive Alliance, just to be clear, not our term, yours. Let's welcome Daisy Cooper, Liberal Democrat MP and Deputy Leader of the party. Daisy, welcome. Your leader, Ed Davey, has said he disagrees with the idea. You've heard what Clive Lewis has said. You're just playing into the Conservatives' hands.
Well, we were really excited to win Chesham and Amersham last week, less than a week ago, actually. And I think what we showed in Chesham and Amersham was that where the Liberal Democrats are the key challengers to the Conservatives, we work incredibly hard to build trust with voters, and voters can see the choice before them. And so when the choice was very clearly between having another Conservative MP or electing a new Liberal Democrat MP, then voters who had voted across the political spectrum for other parties decided that they wanted to vote Liberal Democrat.
Right, Clive, what's wrong with that?
Well, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's, again, assuming that people won't, on the ground, work together. It's already happening in local authorities. There's nothing to stop that happening from the bottom up. And I think leadership should encourage that. It's a natural way of working. I think we understand that we are fragmented, and rather than fighting each other, it's about understanding politically that the Tories have been at this game a lot longer, a lot more successfully than we have. It's about being dynamic enough, flexible enough to be able to respond to a very flexible and dynamic Conservative Party. They're very good at what they do, which is staying in power and absorbing new threats to them, whether that's UKIP, whether that's social liberalism under David Cameron. They are shapeshifters. And the left, the centre-left, has to understand that unless it is more responsive, more reactive, from a grassroots perspective, it's always going to be playing catch-up. It's just a simple mathematical reality when you look at how first past the post works.
Daisy?
Well, I think, again, the Liberal Democrat win in Chesham and Amersham last week gave huge swathes of people across the country hope that Boris Johnson and his government can, in fact, be beaten. And we didn't have a Progressive Alliance in Chesham and Amersham, but voters did look at the choice before them, and they could see that there was a choice between the Conservative and the Liberal Democrat. And given that choice, they made their own minds up as to which party they wanted to vote for.
I guess the point, Daisy, is if there are going to be seats where it's not as clear cut as that, where you can see on quite a significant number of seats where three political parties, in particular Labour, Green and Liberal Democrats, will split the vote between them, allowing Conservatives to come through. It happens time and time again. Now, Amersham was one of those seats where you had a clear lead, and obviously there was tactful voting discipline, but not every seat that's going to happen. So I just think, in my own party, it's about saying to our members, look, it's okay. If you want to work with other political parties to put in a progressive candidate, then they should be allowed to do that without fear of being thrown out, without being threatened. It's just about pragmatic, practical working. That's what the leadership at the top can do. And if you watch and give people that space at the bottom, the members and the voters, they'll do it as well. This isn't about a fix. This is already happening. You have to remember that. It's already happening across town halls and city halls across the country. It's just encouraging it and let it happen. And if that happens, I think, we could see some real results.
Right. I mean, Daisy, it was a stunning victory in Chesham and Amersham. It was a by-election, and upsets do happen, as the Conservatives would read it, that result. And also there is a split in your party. I quoted there Layla Moran, obviously co-wrote that article with Clive Lewis. So your party's not agreed on this idea, is it?
I wouldn't say there's a split. I think, this conversation is going to run and run over the next few months and probably the next couple of years. I'm sure we'll all continue to reflect on it. I certainly wouldn't say that Chesham and Amersham was simply an upset. Don't forget, I won my seat in St Albans in 2019,
yes,
where we beat the Conservative. And now Chesham and Amersham, we have an 8,000 majority. So I'd say slightly more than an upset. And that suggests, that's part of an overall trend where Liberal Democrats are gaining ground, particularly across this blue wall that reaches right from Oxfordshire to Cambridgeshire, and in many places from Oxfordshire to Cambridgeshire, if you just look at those two county councils, for example, Liberal Democrats are working with other parties, particularly Labour, to run those county councils.
Right, could this work, Sonia, for parties on the Liberal left?
While I sort of appreciate Clive's sentiment, I think it is very tricky to make it work on a practical level. And I think what Daisy Cooper just said sort of speaks to some of that, which is that not everyone sees the Liberal Democrats as a centre-left party. And in fact, they attract support in many areas of the country from disaffected Conservative voters who may not vote for it if it was in a progressive alliance with Labour. So I think that's where the tricky bit comes. I think sometimes progressive alliances happen, voters just decide to vote tactically, and in some seats it's very clear where that can work to voters' advantage. And I think, that's great and that works very well for the parties. But I think on a practical level, when you're sort of talking about parties standing down candidates, that's very difficult to get parties to agree on locally, but also it doesn't always go down well with voters because voters see choices as being taken away from them and they don't always like it. So I'm sceptical that we will ever see a working progressive, electoral alliance happen.
Right. Would it worry the Conservatives, Chris, the idea of these parties working together?
I think it would do, but this is, to me, shows a degree of finally waking up to the fact that Labour has not been in power for 11 years and needs to work out how to do so. I mean, it sounds to me like Clive is reinventing what New Labour started out at. I mean, you need to have this desperation to get into power to form these alliances, and he may be rude about the talks between Paddy Ashdown and Tony Blair back in 97, 98, 99, but that was a way of forming this very alliance that Clive talks about. The Tories are a terrifying electoral force. They're like a snake that sheds its skin every 3 years and gets a new leader and appears to be a different government, even though it's the same government that was elected in 2010. And this is an attempt at dealing with that, which has to be applauded, I think, if you want to see a vibrant democracy in this country. But the Tories won't be losing much sleep, I don't think.
Right. I mean, Clive, do you accept that most of your party don't actually agree with you on this?
I don't know. I think there's a growing number that do. And I think, look, one of the key things in this is it's not going to be easy. If it was easy, it would have been done already. Secondly, in terms of standing down here, the whole point about this is that it is organic. There are some places where candidates will stand from all political parties, inevitably. It's not one size fits all. As for, what happened in 97 and a rerun of New Labour, look, we're not in 1997. There has been a fundamental shift, a realignment of millions of working people. You were talking about the triple lock before. People called it the Red Wall. Others now call it the Silver Wall, where former working people who have more of their assets in their house, in pensions, in buy-to-let mortgages, now see themselves more closely associated with the interests of capital, which is where the Conservatives are. They see that as the place where they're going to get the best support, the best deal. So we have to respond to that. We also have to respond to the increasing fragmentation of the United Kingdom. All roads to Westminster, to number 10 for the Labour Party in the past, when we have managed to get over the line, have run through Scotland. Now, that isn't going to happen in the next 2 years, and it may not ever happen if the SNP get their way. So the Labour Party and other centre-left political parties need to understand that unless we adjust and respond to the world as it is, not as we wish it was, or we want it to go back to where it was in 97 or 95 or before that, that's the reality that we face, and that's what we have to deal with. We're feeling our way through this. It's not perfect. It isn't easy. But my God, look at the alternative. It's pretty much a one-party system in this country. And frankly, I don't want to live in a country where it's just a Tory party in complete control.
Right. I mean, the criticisms were wide and deep, Claire, about the Conservative Party from Clive, including that it is a shape-shifting party. But how much of a warning shot was the result of the Chesham and Amersham by-election in terms of accusations that the government and Boris Johnson is ignoring voters, Conservative voters in southern England?
Well, look, my view is that we should always be trying to win every single vote. We should listen very carefully to the people of Chesham and Amersham. I would say that the Liberal Democrats need to decide whether their local policy is going to match their national policy if they're going to do a progressive alliance, because we saw them avowing that they want more house building than the Conservatives in the Chamber on Monday, which wasn't quite what was on their leaflets in Chesham. But just to Clive's point, I think the fundamental problem that Labour has is that he's right. They haven't been able to put together a manifesto that, gets a broad coalition of support in the country. But instead of diagnosing that as the problem and trying to fix it, they're trying to do some sort of gerrymandering by working with other political parties. I mean, it's not clear whether they'd have a shared manifesto. And my belief about elections is that the whole point is you put forward a manifesto to the people, you try and persuade them you've got a positive vision for the country, and then you get into power and you deliver it.
Clive?
Yeah, you do that anyway. Look, this is about Labour. Labour has to up its game, wherever it is, whatever part we play in this progressive alliance. Labour is going to have to start winning and taking back seats from the Conservatives. There's no two ways about that. Having a proper manifesto, having a leadership, policies which work, which are popular, that has to happen. It's not about saying you can forget that and go into some kind of liberal, cosy kind of progressive alliance. We have to win back voters. There's no two ways out of it, but everyone has to play their part in winning where they're best placed to win. That's what we need to do. That's the political reality. We aren't the Conservative Party of the left anymore. That fact is borne out by what's happened in Scotland, what's happening in large parts of the north. Yes, we can win seats back, but we have to be realistic about where we are politically.
Daisy, final word to you. Perhaps you want to answer some of the criticisms there from Claire.
Well, I simply want to say that the Liberal Democrats will continue to put forward our values and our vision for the country. I think on that point about the house building, we've made it absolutely clear that we want community-led development and not a developer free-for-all, which we were very clear about in the by-election, which has been echoed by many Conservative backbenchers as well, including former Prime Minister Theresa May. But our priority is to make sure that we can beat this right-wing Conservative government that doesn't really speak for many people in some parts of the country. I think where many people, including in Cheshire and Amersham, feel taken for granted, and we would continue to win their trust and hopefully win more seats at the next opportunity.
Daisy Cooper, thank you for joining us. Now we're going to rewind 5 years. Remember this?
There is no way of dealing with a decision on this scale except by putting it to the people. Because in the end, this question is about the people. It's about the right of the people of this country to settle their own destiny.
Boris Johnson at a Vote Leave press conference the day the result was announced. He has released a statement this morning marking 5 years since people across the UK went to the polls to vote in the EU referendum. Here it is. 5 years ago, the British people made the momentous decision to leave the European Union and take back control of our destiny. This government got Brexit done, and we've already reclaimed our money, laws, borders and waters. The decision to leave the EU may now be part of our history, but our clear mission is to utilise the freedoms it brings to shape a better future for our people. I just want to show you this tweet from the pollster Ben Page at Ipsos Mori. What I find interesting, he says, is that 68% say how they voted in 2016 is a strong part of their identity versus 48% who say same about political party they support, hashtag Brexit anniversary. That's quite striking. What does that make you think?
Well, that says to me that I think people have to accept that Brexit happened. I mean, I was on the way into the studio here. I was looking outside at the apparent massive demonstration against Brexit. It hasn't happened. I mean, there are more posters attacking Boris Johnson than people outside saying they think Brexit is a bad idea. I think as soon, Clive might agree with this, but as soon as Labour starts to embrace Brexit and the opportunity it might have, which has been slightly suppressed by the COVID pandemic, then you might start seeing results in the ballot box.
Right. Well, Clive, do you need to do exactly that? Embrace Brexit. Talk about the benefits.
Not at all. Look, Brexit has happened, but it's the role of opposition to pick out problems that this government has imposed on itself and the country. We know that there's been a COVID crisis, but we've also seen UK GDP fall by 9.9%. That's more than Germany, more than France, and more than Italy by some margin. So to say that it's just COVID, either the government have to take the rap. Either COVID has been worse than for us than for any other country, or Brexit has had an impact. We're looking at trade deals being negotiated behind closed doors, which are seeing, one with Australia, 0.02%, an increase in GDP in maybe 15 years' time. We're seeing fishermen talking about the trade, farmers in shock at the trade deal that's just been signed with Australia and what it's going to mean for them and livestock.
Yeah.
It's the job of opposition to point out that what Boris Johnson has done, accelerating the breakup of the UK, riots in Northern Ireland, this is a direct result of Brexit and this government's handling of it. And it's the responsibility of a Labour opposition to point that out. That doesn't mean we're trying to turn the clock back to a time before Brexit. It's simply added to where we are and saying that things can be different if we had a different approach, different policies, different politics, and a different attitude towards our closest and biggest trading partner, which is Europe, rather than the hostile war of words that we get on an almost weekly basis from this government.
Claire?
Well, I think it's kind of extraordinary. Clive's talking on one hand about why they can't win elections. We're looking at figures about how strongly people feel about their Brexit vote. And then he's not able to admit that there have been some positives. Of course, some things have changed. But if you look at
what are the positives?
Well, something like the vaccine, I think that's actually been a really clear symbol of what the UK can do when it has, faster regulation, for example, how nimble we can be. And frankly, I think, that's something that people have looked at and they can sort of understand where it is that we're going.
Any other benefits?
Well, the trade deals, I mean, Clive talks about Australia, but he doesn't mention that Australia is actually one of the paving countries towards the CPTPP, fastest growing region in the world, and it's only going to go faster in the next few years. So, yes, there will be lots of benefits.
Sonia?
I think, the big elephant in the room on this, though, is the issue around Northern Ireland. And the fact is that we had a Prime Minister who lied about the implications of an international treaty that he signed. He said it wouldn't involve border checks down the Irish Sea when it did. It was there in the agreement. And we've now seen so much bad blood and bad faith around what's been happening in Northern Ireland. Talks have broken down about how to resolve the issues over the Northern Ireland Protocol, the UK not sticking to what it agreed. And that's really, really problematic. And I think it shows that our approach to Brexit seems to be, let's have the biggest bust-up we can possibly have with the European Union, regardless of the consequences for Northern Ireland, because we don't like them very much. On principle, we're not going to sign up to levels of regulatory alignment with the EU, our closest trading partner, that we're happy to sign up actually to get trade deals elsewhere. And that's a huge problem. So I think it highlights the tensions of Brexit, how it was really an ideological project, and how we're sort of, we've got so much bad blood and bad faith with now the US over the Northern Ireland Protocol, with the EU. The G7 was a really important reminder that we get progress through international agreement, through alliances and making friendships and relationships. And the UK's response to Brexit and, global relations now seems to be, let's make ourselves the biggest pain in the world that we can be.
Right, well, listening to this debate, Claire, would you say it's brought the country together?
Well, I mean, I would say, obviously, in the political world, things are slightly different, but I don't get a lot of my emails from my constituents about Brexit these days. I think people have broadly moved on. Of course, there are the challenges that we're trying to work out. I think Sonia mentions Northern Ireland. That has been difficult, and we are seeing sort of progress being made between Michael Gove and his counterpart. But on the whole, I mean, people have been focused on the pandemic. They've been focused on how we recover. They've been focused on the future.
Right, but you got it wrong, didn't you, Clive, on your side of the argument? Just even using that statistic in terms of who and what people identify with, do you not have to accept how striking that is? 68% said that vote in 2016 still defines them in terms of identity.
I think what the electorate respect are people sticking to their principles and their guns. And at the moment in time, that may be the case. But at some point, in the longer run, people are going to want to hear if things don't go as well, if the spectacular decline in trade with the EU, which we've seen, especially for small and medium-sized businesses.
So you are hoping for things to go wrong in order to back up what you believed at the time?
It's our responsibility to point out where this government has gone wrong. That might not be fashionable at the moment, but that's our responsibility, and it should be done from a position of integrity. And I think people will respect that in the long run, rather than looking at polls and focus groups to try to decide what our policy should be. Do what you think is right for the country, say what you think is right, and eventually people will respect that. I genuinely believe that.
Right. Chris?
Well, Clive appears to be waiting for people to come round to him. I mean, does he want to rejoin the European Union at some point through his Progressive Alliance?
Clive?
Through the Progressive Alliance, no. Would I like to see us join the European Union at some point in the future? Yes, I would. I'd love that. Yeah.
Chris?
There you go.
Well, that's part of the problem. I mean, people, I've gone grey in the past 5 years trying to cover the shenanigans of you guys in Parliament trying to deliver on the 2016 referendum. And that's the point. I mean, people see that as a kind of defining point.
That's not what we're talking about now. We're talking about the reality of being outside of the European Union. I'm not talking about, but I'm just being honest with you, longer term, do I think we could go back to Europe? It's a possibility. We could be out of it. But the reality is it's a job of opposition to point out the mistakes this government is wanting. But what you seem to want is you seem to want to agree with you on everything. But you want us to all agree that you're right. Well, no, you're not. There are things that you're getting wrong, and there are things that we're going to point out that you're getting wrong.
Claire?
So it's as simple as that. It's not about.
All right.
People might not like that. It might not be fashionable, but it's our responsibility to do that.
Hang on, Sonia. Claire?
I mean, I think Clive should think less about what he thinks the government wants to hear, and I think he should start thinking about what the public wants to hear, because he talks on one hand about needing to be a dynamic and flexible party, then he talks about rigidly sticking to principles which the public have rejected in multiple elections.
That doesn't mean being all things to all people. You know, there's a difference. You know, about being flexible and dynamic. That does not mean
just about
saying
listening.
what you want people to hear, you say. There's a difference, and people will cotton on to that pretty quickly.
Right, and Sonia, just finally on this, I mean, do you think that the divisions that we saw and still continue, it seems, today, despite the fact that the Labour Party or Keir Starmer certainly was reported as saying he didn't want to talk about or hear the party talk too much about Brexit? Clive obviously hasn't been quite listening to that memo that's come out. Do you think it will continue to shape our politics, that division?
I think so, and I think it wasn't just about Brexit either. I think it's about long-term changes that are going on in the electorate that Brexit captured, with voters no longer falling on a simple left-right spectrum anymore, but being a bit more multi-dimensional. So whether voters are socially conservative or liberal also mattering. So I think that will continue to be important. But I don't think it's inconceivable. You know, I don't think we should dismiss out of hand the idea that in the long term, actually, public attitudes might shift towards the EU. And I think while we're not going to have a really divisive debate in this country, I hope, about, you know, whether Brexit was right or wrong for the next 10 years. I do think that the economic issues that accompany Brexit will make themselves felt. People will be aware of them. They may not necessarily associate them with Brexit, but that might start in the longer term to shift people's perceptions, because at the end of the day, the question is, why did we even leave the EU in the first place? And it doesn't seem like the government have come up with a very good answer yet. They're going to have to, because otherwise I think public attitudes, especially as, you know, generationally, I think the attitudes of younger people towards the European Union are more positive. I think, you know, in the sort of over the next 10 to 20 years, we might see a public attitude shift back.
All right. We're going to obviously bring you Prime Minister's questions in just under 5 minutes' time. But first of all, a straightforward question to all of you. Do women work harder than men? Well, while you ponder that for a moment, it seems that David Cameron, the former Conservative Prime Minister, thought so. Let me just show you this quote from a podcast done by Samantha Cameron, where she says, "My husband always says he loves employing women because they work harder. They are perfectionists. What you get out of them is often much better than men." Do you agree, Claire?
I always find it quite uncomfortable when people try and say women are like this and men are like that. I mean, I'd love to try and tell Liz Truss or Priti Patel that women are softer and cuddlier in the workplace. And I'd love to try and tell the men around the cabinet table that they're working less hard than their female peers. So I think you should just judge everyone by their individual merit.
Sonia, what do you think? David Cameron right?
Well, I think there is some evidence, actually, that during the pandemic, women have been picking up much more of the homeschooling and the domestic work, which women have always done throughout time, as well as going out to work. So I think there probably is some evidence on that level that women are working harder because they do the bulk of work at home in terms of looking after the kids and homeschooling, and many of them are working as well. So on that level, I think there probably is some evidence for the fact that women do more.
Right. Were you surprised, though, to hear that that's what David Cameron had said? Because actually the reality, when you talk about the number or numbers of women in the cabinets that he presided over, only 4 of the 23 cabinet positions were held by women when he entered Downing Street in 2010, and that figure rose to just 7 when he left in 2016. Sonia?
That's very true, and I think there is a case of practicing what you preach. And I think one of the things that you can see about this existing cabinet as well is that lots of the decision making has been done mainly by men in the cabinet, particularly towards the beginning of the pandemic. And I think that really felt itself made in terms of the impacts of decisions, the impact they had on women's lives. So I do think that, David Cameron maybe isn't practiced it or hasn't in the past practiced what he preaches, but it's positive to hear him talk about women positively in the workplace, though, because we do know, if you look at the evidence, that women are disadvantaged because of unconscious bias in the workplace, particularly in male-dominated industries like journalism and politics that tend to be male, pale and stale.
Chris?
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel very unqualified for this conversation, Joe, but I do agree. I think with what Sonia said, I think the women do work harder. They have a lot. They have to, you know, they often are unfairly maybe made to do more of the housework at home. and they have child rearing falls on them. I think it's harder for women. I think Cameron could have done better. He was told he had a woman problem, wasn't he, back in 2010, 2016, and he didn't do much about it. So it's a shame to hear this privately from Sam Cameron. They couldn't do more about it when he's in office.
Clive?
Well, they're certainly paid less, by and large, than men. So I suppose if they're doing the same amount of work for less pay, they are working harder. As regards to some kind of psychological disposition, I couldn't answer that. I'm not an expert. What I do know is that millions of people, and I'm not trying to be holier than thou here, what I do know is that millions of women across the country throughout the pandemic, whether they're as nurses, social care workers, shop assistants, have been working phenomenally hard. But then so have people of both sexes. But definitely they're paid less for exactly the same amount of work that men do. So in that sense, technically, relatively speaking, they do work harder for less.
Right. I mean, Claire, would you like to see a more even split in the cabinet and other sort of political forum?
Well, I think all of these things are incredibly important. Actually, I agree with lots of things that Sonia and Clive and Chris were saying. And one of the things that I actually do as an MP is try and increase sort of access and opportunities for women to come into politics.
Right, but in terms of actually guaranteeing that there might be a more even split, is that worth pursuing, Claire?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we need to look for equality in all types of people with diversity around these tables around the top. So not just women, but definitely women as well, but also people from different ethnic minority backgrounds, people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, people from different regions across the country. I think all of these things need to be represented, and we should be pursuing that.
And the best way to do that, Clive?
Best way to do that is through paying people equally, paying people properly for what they do across the board, whether they're men or women, and whatever ethnic diversity they come from, giving people equality of access to those rights and those jobs. That's what we need to do. But unfortunately, that's still a long way from that.
Chris?
Well, I wonder if Claire might back all women shortlists for the Tory party to go into the next election. That might lift the number of female Tory MPs in the Commons.
Well, we can have a really long conversation about this.
Or a short one. You've got time.
I think it's about access, about building the pipeline, making sure you're getting people in and making sure that they see this as an opportunity for themselves.
Chris, that doesn't sound like a yes.
No, not really. I mean, one of Claire might feel it might be unfair to good men who are being overlooked in favour of tokenistically letting more women onto shortlists.
Yes, and also I think it's sort of saying to the women that maybe you can't win. Like, I won against 2 men in my shortlist, and I know there's lots of women in my year who are absolutely fantastic who had the same.
Clive, you're looking sceptical?
That's not the point. I mean, the point is if there is systemic structural sexism in society. That's why we in the Labour Party have a women shortlist. It's because we understand it's a reality. And if it's a reality, if you're not denying it, and maybe some people in this conversation are, then you're going to make sure that you as a progressive organisation are going to try to alleviate that. And that's why we have a women shortlist. You could do it for other groups as well, but that's why we do it. And it's right to do that.
Well, I'm just not deny that there's sexism in society.
It's just not. It's a lot of this idea that sort of all women shortlists are unfair hinges on the idea that we have a meritocracy in the first place when it comes to these things, and we absolutely don't. Like, when you do have things like structural discrimination operating in the workplace, in politics, it's not a level playing field. Mediocre men get through when really brilliant women don't. So when progress is very, very slow, if you just leave it to happen organically, you need something like all women shortlists to make sure you get more women into the top jobs, because that's how to change up culture.
Converted, Claire?
Well, I would target the meritocracy. I think that's what we should be pursuing, and that's absolutely what we need. And to do that, you do have to change attitudes, and you do have to take that on. But I think that's a better route than trying to do sort of all women lists.
But that takes. I mean, that means you don't get change. Because
well, I mean, we are
very
getting
hard
change.
To do change. It's very slow, though. It's very slow. You don't get the reason that the Labour Party was able to get so many female MPs to Parliament in '97 was because of all women shortlists. I'm going to have to
I'm going to have to cut you short. Good woman though you are. That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of our guests. It's Prime Minister's Questions.
The European Union. It has allowed us to take back control of the issues that matter to the people of the United Kingdom. It has given us the freedom to establish 8 free ports across the country, driving new investment, to develop the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, to protect and invest in jobs and renewal across every part of the UK, to control our immigration system, and to sign a historic trade deal with Australia. It will allow us to shape a better future for our people. Mr. Speaker, over 5.6 million EU citizens have already applied to our EU settlement scheme, and I would encourage anyone who may still be eligible to apply ahead of the deadline next week. Mr. Speaker, this week is Armed Forces Week, and I'm sure colleagues from across the House will wish to join me in thanking our fantastic armed forces and their families for their service to our country. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others in addition to my duties in this House. I shall have further such meetings later today.
Stevens. Mr. Speaker, Prime Minister, we are to host COP26. Our goal is net zero by 2050. To achieve that target will require innovative policies, and a free market approach would help. Therefore, if we were to make solar panels compulsory for all new residential builds, we immediately create a large market. It will lead to innovation, lower prices, job creation, and contribute towards our 2050 target. Will the Prime Minister support such a policy initiative?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes a very interesting suggestion, which I will certainly look into, though I should caution that some homes don't have enough space on their roof, or indeed have their roofs angled in the right way to make solar panels viable. But what we are already doing is tightening our standards to ensure that new homes produce at least 75% lower CO2 emissions compared to current standards, on our way to net zero by 2050.
Let's go to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why, under this government, has the number of rape convictions and prosecutions fallen to a record low?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, one of the first things I said when I came to this dispatch box as Prime Minister was that I thought that rape prosecutions and convictions were too low, and that's why we have the end-to-end rape review, and that's why we've been investing in independent sexual violence advisors and independent domestic violence advisors, another 27 million. That's why we've been investing more in the Crown Prosecution Service, another 85 million people. We're also dealing with the misery experienced by rape victims and survivors who have to hand over their mobile phones, Mr. Speaker, which I think has been one of the evidential problems that has arisen in prosecuting rape cases. But what we've also been doing, Mr. Speaker, is imposing tougher sentences for serious sexual and violent offences. And it would have been good to have some support in that from the right honourable gentleman and the benches opposite.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, we all agree that the figures are appalling. The question is why? The government's own review makes clear that rape convictions and prosecutions have halved since 2016. Halved. We know that's nothing to do with the pandemic because this is a 5-year trend. We know it isn't because there are fewer rape cases being reported, because that number's gone up significantly. So let me return to the question that the Prime Minister hasn't answered. Why does the Prime Minister think that rape prosecutions and convictions have plummeted on his watch?
Prime Minister.
Because, Mr. Speaker, as he knows very well, because he has some experience of this matter, there are considerable evidential problems, particularly in recovering data from mobile phones, and that has been an obstacle to the speedy preparation of cases. And too often, let's be frank, too often cases go from the police to the Crown Prosecution Service not in a fit state, and too often those cases are not in a fit state when they come to court. And there is not a good enough join-up, Mr. Speaker, across the criminal justice system. And that is exactly what we are addressing, Mr. Speaker, now by our investments with our end-to-end rape review. And what would be good, Mr. Speaker, is if we have some support from the opposition for tougher sentences for rapists and serious sexual offenders. What kind of a signal does it send when they won't even back tougher sentences, Mr. Speaker?
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister knows very well why we voted against his bill, precisely because it did more to protect statues than women. But since he's brought it up, Mr. Speaker, let's address the central question. Prime Minister, 98.4% of reported rapes don't end up in a charge. 98.4%. And therefore the question of sentence never arises in those cases. So since he's brought up the bill, it's his main defence, it seems, Can he tell me, point to what provision in the bill, what clause, what chapter, what part of that bill will do anything to change the fact that 98.4% of reported rape cases don't end in charges and don't get to sentence? Which clause, part, chapter or words in that bill? Point to one thing.
Mr. Speaker, well, let me point to section 106 and 107 of that bill, which Labour voted down, Mr. Speaker, which would have stopped the early release of rapists at their halfway point in their sentence. What kind of a signal, what kind of a message does that send, Mr. Speaker, to people who commit the crimes of rape? It is very, very important that the message should go out from this House of Commons that we will not tolerate serious sexual violence. And I'm afraid that the right honourable gentleman has not been supporting that message. What we are doing now is bringing forward measures by investing in independent domestic violence, independent sexual violence advisors to ensure that victims and survivors of the crime of rape have people in whom they can confide and trust throughout that miserable period when they're in the criminal justice system. And another thing we're doing, Mr. Speaker, is recruiting record numbers of police officers. And I'm proud to say that 40% of our new recruits are female, Mr. Speaker, which I believe will be a great consolation and use to those who are victims and survivors of rape.
Starmer. What an appalling answer. I asked him why 98.4% of cases aren't getting into the system, and he talks about a sentence. But that is the problem. If the Prime Minister thinks that's the answer, that is why we've got these terrible rates of conviction and of prosecution. The answer is there's nothing in that bill. The truth is victims of rape are being failed. Now, Mr. Speaker, they're not just my words, they're in the government's own report. Victims of rape are being failed. There's no escaping that appalling figure, Prime Minister. 98.4% of rape cases ending without anybody being charged. And those that do get in the system take years to go through. Does the Prime Minister accept that cuts to the criminal justice system have contributed to that appalling situation?
Prime Minister! No, Mr. Speaker, because we've increased the numbers of people in the CPS by at least 200, Mr. Speaker, specifically dedicated to helping to prosecute the crime of rape and sexual violence. And, Mr. Speaker, we are absolutely determined to stamp it out. This is a problem that has been going worse because of the evidential difficulties caused by the data recovery process and the lack of unity, the lack of joined-up thinking between all parts of the criminal justice system. That is something that this government is now addressing by more investment, by putting more police out on the street, and also by having tougher sentences. And finally, it would be good to hear him support it.
Keir Starmer. Mr. Speaker, I spent 5 years as Director of Public Prosecution prosecuting thousands of rape cases. I don't need lectures, but I do know the impact of cuts on our criminal justice service. The government can't make cuts, significant cuts to the Crown Prosecution Service, 25% cuts to the Ministry of Justice, close half the courts in England and Wales, yes, half the courts, and now pretend that a small budget increase will solve the problem. But, Mr. Speaker, this is more than just about cuts. The rate review is welcome, but it's weak. The Victims Commissioner, the government's Victims Commissioner, described the review as underwhelming. It could have been 10 times stronger. That review is littered with pilots and consultations on proposals that have literally been discussed for years and years. It is so unambitious. Mr. Speaker, isn't it the case that despite these shameful figures, and they are shameful, the government still isn't showing the urgency needed to tackle the epidemic of violence against women and girls?
Minister. No, Mr. Speaker, because we've also brought in the landmark domestic violence bill, which, again, it would have been good if we'd had wholehearted support from the Labour Party opposite. And, Mr. Speaker, no, because this government has brought in much tougher sentences for serious sexual and violent offenders. And he can't, no matter how much he wriggles and squirms, Mr. Speaker, he can't get away from the simple fact that on a 3-line whip, he got his party to vote against tougher sentences for serious sexual and violent offenders. That, Mr. Speaker, is weak.
Keir Starmer.
You can always tell when he's losing, Mr. Speaker.
I want both sides. It's a very, very emotive and important issue. I need to hear the question and the answers. I certainly don't expect shouting from the backbenches. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, on the Prime Minister's watch, rape prosecution convictions are at a record low. Court backlogs are at a record high. Victims are waiting longer for justice, and criminals are getting away with it. This wasn't inevitable. It's the cost of a decade of Conservative cuts. And even now, the government isn't showing the urgency and the ambition that's needed. Mr. Speaker, the Justice Secretary has done the rarest of things for this government and apologised. But I note the Prime Minister hasn't done that today. It's time he did, that he took some responsibility and backed it up with action. Will he do so?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, as I said to the right honourable gentleman, and I fought to have tougher action against rapists and sexual offenders throughout my time as Mayor of London, and of course to all the victims of rape and sexual violence, all the victims and survivors. Of course, I say sorry for the trauma that they have been through, the frustration that they go through because of the inadequacies of the criminal justice system. We are fixing that. We're fixing that with by investing another £1 billion in clearing the court backlogs, in ensuring that they have people that they can listen to and entrust who will help them through the trials of the criminal justice experience, Mr. Speaker. But above all, we are helping them by getting our courts moving again. The fastest, most efficient way to do that, as he knows, is to get our country moving again, which is what we are doing with the fastest vaccination rollout anywhere in Europe, Mr. Speaker. We are getting on with the job, Mr. Speaker. They jabber, we jab, Mr. Speaker. They dither, we deliver. They vacillate, and we vaccinate, Mr. Speaker.
Let's go to Craig Whittaker. Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Levelling Up Fund is a superb opportunity for local areas like Calderdale Council to improve infrastructure and relieve the misery in local areas. With that aim, will my right honourable friend take a serious look at Calderdale's submission, which lacks support, has no consultation nor consensus with partners, and instead of relieving infrastructure problems, ploughs on with one of the council's failed and doomed projects, which does nothing at all to level up and has no support locally?
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and I hope very much that I think the Levelling Up Fund has the potential to do massive good for Calderdale and indeed the whole country. And I hope that Calderdale Council will have listened to his strictures this morning and this afternoon and will act.
They now come to the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, the Herald newspaper revealed that in the middle of the pandemic, Tory ministers secretly directed funds from an emergency COVID contract to carry out polling on the Union. This evidence was uncovered in official documents submitted to the High Court, so the Prime Minister would be well advised to be very careful in his answer to this question. And it's a very simple question. Did the UK Government use a £560,000 emergency COVID contract to conduct constitutional campaigning on the Union?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid I'm not aware of the contract to which the right honourable gentleman refers, but what I can tell him is that I think that the Union and the benefits of the Union have been incalculable throughout the COVID pandemic. And the vaccine rollout, which I've just mentioned to the right honourable gentleman opposite, is of course something that vaccines have been pioneered in Scotland, they've been brewed in Oxford, bottled in Wales, rolled out throughout the UK, and I think it's a tribute to the Union that he seeks to undermine.
Ian Blackford.
The Prime Minister has just demonstrated, not for the first time, that he hasn't got a clue. Mr. Speaker, the answer to the question is yes. Whether it's redecorating the Downing Street flat or siphoning off COVID funds for political campaigning, the pattern is clear. The Tories simply can't be trusted. Because, let's be very clear as to what happened here. These emergency COVID contracts were supposed to be used for things like PPE, for our brave doctors and for nurses fighting COVID. Instead, during the height of this deadly pandemic, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, used these emergency contracts to commission political research, and I quote, on attitudes to the UK Union. What's worse, he handed these lucrative contracts to long-term friends and former employees. In essence, this was a UK government contract that sanctioned corrupt campaigning, Prime Minister. If the Prime Minister has even a shred of credibility, will he now commit to a full public inquiry on this gross misuse of public funds?
General. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can't think of a better use of public funds than making sure that the whole of the UK fights the COVID pandemic together. And that's what we do. And thanks to the UK Treasury, we were able to spend £407 billion supporting jobs and families in Scotland, Mr. Speaker. We were able to use the British Army to send vaccines throughout the whole of the UK, Mr. Speaker. I believe that the story of this last 2 years has shown the incalculable value of our union and the strength of our union, and that we are better, Mr. Speaker, together.
Mark Paulson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's groundbreaking 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution has ambitious targets for a switch to zero-emission electric vehicles, and the UK's automotive manufacturers are ready to deliver, with vehicle manufacture taking place close to where batteries are made because of the high proportion of an electric vehicle's cost and weight made up by the battery. Mr. Speaker, Coventry is the historic home of the car industry and the headquarters of Jaguar Land Rover, who made the car in which the Prime Minister travelled to Parliament today. So will he give his support to the proposal to build a gigafactory at Coventry Airport?
Well, I have fond memories of visiting my own friend's constituency and using an electric taxi, which they thought was impossible 15 years ago, Mr. Speaker, but we got it done, and we'll make sure that his constituencies across the country are in the lead in building new electric vehicles for this country and for the world.
Ed Davey.
Mr. Speaker, in Chesham and Amersham, several people told me how they struggle week in, week out to care for a family loved one while trying to hold down a job. They told me they felt the Prime Minister wasn't interested in them, that he wasn't listening to them, that he didn't care about them. And Mr. Speaker, such inspiring working family carers aren't unique to Chesham and Amersham. There are thousands in every constituency, no doubt in every seat across the so-called Conservative heartlands. An estimated 7 million people were juggling unpaid care and jobs last year, Mr. Speaker. So what is the Prime Minister going to do to make these people's lives a little bit easier? When is he going to stop taking working family carers for granted?
Mr. Speaker, I salute working family carers and people who look after loved ones as they have done throughout the pandemic. And what we have tried to do, as I just said in my answer to the right honourable gentleman, to look after families for the last 18 months to the best of this country's ability, supporting them with furlough, with all sorts of schemes, and in addition putting unprecedented sums into social care. But there is nothing any government could do, no words that I could express that would be enough to requite the care and love that is given by family carers to those they look after.
Steve Double.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're currently experiencing a housing crisis in Cornwall where local people are being priced out of the market, whether to buy or rent, by prices being inflated due to the huge demand of people wanting to move to Cornwall to live or buy a holiday home. This is a long-standing problem, but in recent months it has become the worst it has ever been. As the government bring forward their reforms of the planning system, can my right honourable friend assure me and the people in Cornwall that this will not be about building lots of homes for wealthy people to buy, but will ensure that the people of Cornwall are able to access the homes that they need?
My honourable friend raises a point that has been raised repeatedly with me in Cornwall, and we are absolutely determined to address the issue in question and to work with Linda Taylor, the leader of Cornwall Council, the newly Conservative Cornwall Council to ensure that we build local homes for local people so that young people growing up in Cornwall have the chance of owning their own home.
Let's go to Julie Elliott. Julie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst football clubs, charities, mums and dads in Sunderland and across our country were searching for that old laptop in the cupboard to give a child the data and device needed to learn during the pandemic and lockdown, the largest company in the world was throwing brand new tech into landfill. Amazon don't pay their fair share of tax, they treat their staff badly, and now they deny internet access to our poorest children. Will the Prime Minister join me today in unequivocally condemning this appalling practice by Amazon?
I was shocked and amazed to hear that computers were literally being sent to landfill in the way that the Honourable Lady describes, and I think the whole House would agree that the practice is bizarre and unacceptable. One thing that we are doing, and I'm sure Amazon will wish to rectify it as fast as possible, but one thing we are doing to get to her second point, Mr. Speaker, is we're ensuring that tech giants and other companies pay their fair share of tax on their sales within this country, thanks to the agreement that my right honourable friend the Chancellor struck at the G7.
Rob Butler. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With new houses comes the need for new infrastructure, and in Aylesbury we particularly need better transport links to cope with our growing population. Will my right honourable friend therefore ensure that the Aylesbury spur of East-West Rail is approved? There's a better business case than there is for HS2, and the spur has the great advantage of being the railway we do want rather than the one that we don't.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm to my honourable friend that the Department of Transport's review is looking at the design and construction of the Aylesbury spur, but I have to caution that the cost of constructing that spur is currently very high, and we need to look at the numbers to ensure that they come down, and I hope he may be helpful in that matter.
Let's go to John Littleson. John.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every day the Prime Minister strengthens the case for Scottish independence. His recent trade deal sees food producers in Oakland and South Perthshire subjected to unfair competition from low-welfare Australian producers, a country where animals can be transported to slaughter for 2 days in the baking heat without water. So farmers, join seafood producers, musicians and a host of other sectors who realise his Brexit assurances were substance-free hot air. But can I ask him, when he's planning his next COVID-safe visit to Scotland, please come soon. Every visit is a tonic for us and toxic for his Scottish Tory apologists.
Prime Minister.
I can tell I don't want to disappoint the honourable gentleman, but I am seldom away from Scotland and can't wait to be back there as soon as possible, Mr. Speaker, after the record polls secured by Scottish Conservatives at the recent election. But yet again, this abuse of Australia that has high animal welfare standards and a negative attitude to the opportunities that free trade offers this country and the people of Scotland. When's he going to stop running down Scottish agriculture and the potential of Scottish farming?
The Wheeler.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, join with me in thanking Derbyshire Police for their excellent work in rounding up and arresting and charging people involved in the recent incidents of stabbing, where one young man was murdered and others badly hurt. This murder in Swadlincote, a very rare event, has caused concern amongst residents, but the very swift action taken by our Derbyshire Police has taken the perpetrators off the street. Clearly, more police in South Derbyshire would be very much welcomed by our residents.
My honourable friend is entirely right to raise the appalling murder in Swadlincote, and we're making sure, by the way, with our police and crime bill, that such crimes are dealt with in a more expeditious way with greater powers for the police. But we're also recruiting, as I say, 20,000 more police, including an additional 85, she'll be pleased to know, in Derbyshire.
Right, let's go to Dr. Philippa Whitford. Philippa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. During the Brexit referendum, the Prime Minister promised there would be no change in the rights of EU citizens in the UK. Yet in a week's time, those without settled status will lose the right to work, rent a flat or access free healthcare. This government has demanded repeated grace periods during the Brexit process. So will he now finally agree to extend the deadline for EU citizens?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the EU settlement scheme has been one of the great successes of our recent Brexit negotiations, and it has produced 5.6 million applications already. And I seem to remember that we were told there are only 3.2 million or 3 million to begin with. I think that everybody knows what the deadline is. I hope people will come forward and do what 5.6 million people, other people, have already done themselves.
Sir James Davies.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Large sections of the Wine near St Asaph in my constituency currently have very poor broadband connections. Topped-up gigabit vouchers via community fibre partnerships have the potential to raise much of the £200,000 needed to address the situation, but there's a 24% shortfall. What can my right honourable friend do to assist my constituents stuck in this position?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and I can tell him that BT Openreach has recently extended its offer of commercial coverage for gigabit broadband to services in his area, in the community that he mentions, and that is partly, Mr. Speaker, because of the super deduction in taxation and investment that we were able to. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor, recently announced at the budget.
Tops.
Mr. Speaker, the Electoral Commission performs an important independent role in the regulation of UK elections. Whether investigating dark money or simply attempts to undermine our democracy, the role is critical in ensuring public confidence in our democratic processes. Now, with his government seeking to neuter the Electoral Commission, what exactly is the Prime Minister planning that requires an attempt for his government to be able to direct the independent regulator?
For the sake of brevity, Mr. Speaker, I think I can say absolutely nothing.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has my right honourable friend had a chance to review the recent announcement from the Foreign Office that Britain is to cut its support for tackling neglected tropical diseases by a staggering 95%? This will not only write off quite a considerable British taxpayers' investment in this important work, but it will also mean that 280 million drugs and tablets and vaccines have to be written off as well and burnt and destroyed. Does he know that the World Health Organization has said that this one act will lead to the maiming, blinding, disruption of lives and death of hundreds of thousands of people? So will my right honourable friend accept and respect the statement that Mr. Speaker made from his chair last Monday on June the 14th, that there must be a meaningful vote in this House on this matter? Will he see if it can be brought forward before the end of term and the summer recess? And if not, will he ensure that the point 7 is brought back from the start of next year?
Mr. Speaker, there will be an Estimates Day debate, I'm told by my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, on overseas aid. But I must say I just don't accept the characterisation that my right honourable friend, for all his expertise, for all his learning in this matter, has just given of this country and our contribution to the fight against disease around the world. In spite of all the difficulties we face, we're contributing £10 billion in odour this year, in spite of the colossal expenditure that the British state has been forced to make to look after families around the country, jobs and families around the country. And in addition to that, Mr. Speaker, we are spending £1.6 billion on supporting COVAX, £458 million supporting Gavi, and colleagues should remember that 1 in 3 of the COVAX vaccines that are saving lives, as my honourable friend knows, saving lives around the world, 1 in 3 is the direct result of the actions of the UK government. I think the people of this country should be very proud of what we're achieving.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday was Windrush Day, the 73rd anniversary of the arrival of Caribbean people from Commonwealth countries in 1948. Yet this year it's a reminder of the appalling failure of the government's Windrush compensation scheme, which has been disturbingly slow and extensively bureaucratic. That at least 21 people have died while waiting for justice, and only 687 people have received any payment at all. Mr. Speaker, given the repeated delays and failures of the Home Office to provide justice for the Windrush generation, does the Prime Minister now accept this scheme must be handed over to an independent body to prevent prolonged suffering?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I accept the injustice that was done to the Windrush generation, and I renew the apologies on behalf of the government for our share of responsibility. And yes, I do want to make sure that the compensation scheme is accelerated. And I spoke to people responsible for distributing that scheme just the other night, Mr. Speaker. But what I also said, what I hope the House would agree, is that I hope that the name Windrush in due time will not just be associated with that injustice, though it was appalling, but will be associated with the amazing contribution and sacrifice and effort of the Windrush generation to this country. And that Windrush is a positive name for the people of this country, and that Windrush indeed, Mr. Speaker, is regarded as the Mayflower of our country.
Esther Macbeth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When High Speed 2 was first proposed, the estimated cost was £37.5 billion. The latest estimated cost is now over £150 billion and rising fast. Is there a price at which the Prime Minister would accept that High Speed 2 is no longer value for money, or is he determined to build it irrespective of whatever the final cost will be? Wouldn't it be better to put this white elephant project out of its misery? Get rid of High Speed 2 and instead deliver high-speed broadband, reliable 1 gigabit capability at a fraction of the cost to every household, which would be much more useful for everyone in all our communities.
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right about the importance of gigabit broadband. That's why the coverage has gone up just since I've been Prime Minister, I think from 9% of our country to 60% this year, and we hope to get up to 100% in the course of the next few years. I can't agree with her, however, about HS2. This House did vote for it. It has the potential to do a massive amount of good in levelling up across the whole of the UK, and indeed I think even the Liberal Democrats voted for it, Mr. Speaker. I see him there. I think he voted. You wouldn't think it to judge from some of their recent campaigns, would you, Mr. Speaker? But that's the thing about the Liberal Democrats, Mr. Speaker. They can vote for one thing and then say another thing when it comes to elections.
Let's go to Bel Ribeiro Addy. Bel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the COVID-19 pandemic exploded, scientists warned that with the rapid transmission, more dangerous variants would emerge and vaccines could lose efficacy in the face of mutations. Now, variant upon variant has sparked surge testing, further lockdowns, and a recent delay to the end of restrictions, with 41 people already reported to have the more virulent Delta Plus variant. The Prime Minister held his vaccine donation as putting people squarely above profit, but this is lousy in the face of the fact that intellectual property is driving global supply shortages. So does the Prime Minister understand why it's no use for the G7 to promise 1 billion doses at some point in the future when people are dying now, and the success of our vaccination programme is under threat from emerging variants now? And will he reconsider his negligible vaccine donation policy and join over 100 countries in supporting the vaccine intellectual property waiver?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I really think it is satirical to say that the G7's efforts have so far been negligible. What they agreed at Carbis Bay was another billion on top of the billion that have already been contributed. The UK is putting in, as she knows, 100 million up to another 100 million up to June next year. And as for the points she makes about variants and vaccines, she should know that on all the advice that we have at present is that the vaccines are effective against all the variants that we can currently see.
Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister promise that the forthcoming planning bill will not restrict the right of residents to have their say over what is built in their neighbourhood?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. And what we want to ensure What we want to ensure, yes, because we won't have it, I won't have this misrepresented by the Liberal Democrats in the way that they do, and everybody will know. I won't have it misrepresented by anybody, Mr. Speaker. Because what we want to do is to ensure that we give the young people in this country the chance of home ownership, which the party opposite would ruthlessly deny them. And what we want to do, Mr. Speaker, by our levelling up agenda, is help young people across the country and make sure, by the way, that we relieve pressure on the overheating southeast and ensure that we build back better across the whole of the UK. And that is the objective of our planning bill.
We're going to leave Prime Minister's questions there for this week. Let me welcome our guests for this part of the programme. Amanda Milling, co-chair of the Conservative Party, Sarah Jones, Shadow Minister for Policing. Welcome to both of you. And Vicky Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor. Vicky, let's start with the questions from Keir Starmer. They were all dedicated to the number of rape prosecutions, which have fallen dramatically, in fact, to a record low. He used a number of statistics, and all of them striking. 98.4% of rape cases don't get to court, and that is startling. What's happened?
Yeah, and I think that is the point here. I think people always, for a long time, have realised that the situation is bad and it's not working. Something is going terribly wrong. But the fact that it's got even worse, and as he says, this is just not because of backlog in court cases, because of COVID. This is, as he says, is a 5-year trend. So there's clearly a major issue here. And the question, of course, as ever, is what do you do about it? Now, the government has launched this big review. We heard from the Secretary of State for Justice last week who felt the need to apologise to victims of rape and sexual offences, admitting that things were just not good enough. But I think what was interesting listening to the Prime Minister, and actually it's something Robert Buckland talked about last week, the Prime Minister is saying that cases too often are not in a fit state when they're handed to the Crown Prosecution Service. Now, that really is a criticism of the police, saying that they're not approaching this in the correct way, that actually the paperwork they're coming up with when it goes to prosecution is not good enough. Robert Buckland apologising and really talking about a complete culture change. It's not just about funding, that will be part of it, of course, but it's about the way that this is approached, the way that victims are treated. So many of them, we've heard from them for years, saying they feel like they're the ones being prosecuted, not the alleged perpetrator. So a culture change is what they're talking about, and Labour insisting it actually needs more than that. It does need extra funding as well.
Amanda Milling, only 1.6% of rapes that are reported result in someone being charged. Now, that means that considerably fewer than 1 in every 100 rapes actually leads to justice for its victims. They are shocking figures. How do you explain them?
So rape and sexual violence is an abhorrent crime, and this is why we could see that there were some issues with the system, and this is why we undertook the review and have created the action plan, because as Robert Buckland apologised for anybody who'd been let down by the system, and the review has identified issues with the system. But this is why we want to ensure that victims of rape and sexual violence get the justice they deserve, and also those who perpetrate get punished.
Right, but why has the problem got so much worse in the last few years, particularly the last 5 years? It's been on a downward trend since 2016.
So this was, the action, the review has identified a number of different issues in terms of the way the system works. And what we're now doing is implementing this action plan so that the system does work, so that the police, the prosecutors and also the courts ensure that the victims of rape and sexual violence do get that justice.
Right. Sarah, I just want to show our viewers this tweet from Labour's Deputy Leader Angela Rayner. Boris Johnson cares more about starting a culture war about statues than locking up rapists and protecting women from violent crime, sexual violence and harassment. It's not complicated. #PMQ. She sent that out just as Keir Starmer was starting with his questions. That's a pretty extraordinary thing to say. Is Labour playing politics with this?
Well, I thought the Prime Minister's response to very reasonable questions about the crisis that we face was extraordinarily awful. To respond by saying this is jabber and to kind of heckle and shout when, the first job of government is to keep people safe.
Sure.
And this government is not keeping women and girls safe from serious violence.
But what about Angela Rayner's response?
Committee.
I'm asking you about the deputy leader of the Labour Party's response. I hear your criticism of the approach used by Boris Johnson, according to you. But what about Angela Rayner? Was that also a sensible way forward?
Let me explain. I'm on the committee for the police crime sentencing and courts bill. And yesterday, we said we have to send a message to any men that think it's okay to rape a woman, that it's not okay, and there should be a minimum sentence of 7 years. The Conservatives voted against that. And Angela's point is at the same time, in the same bill, they've introduced increased sentences of up to 10 years for damaging a statue. Now, we have to look at the facts. As you just said, between, about 99 out of 100 reported rapes do not lead to charge, let alone to conviction. And this is a massively bad indictment of this government's policy, cutting services, yes, but also completely wrong priorities in terms of funding, in terms of interventions, in terms of support for victims, and in terms of sentencing. We pushed the government yesterday, vote for a 7-year minimum sentence, and the government said no.
What do you say in response, Amanda Milling? You will have heard these criticisms being levelled at the government in terms of priorities when it comes to that crime policing and sentencing bill, and comparing the sentence that you would get for attacking a statue, criminal damage, compared to the sentence that you might get for committing a rape.
So this bill is one which is all about keeping our streets safe. It's about being tough on crime and having tougher sentences. And let's be honest, Labour voted against this bill. It's second reading, and they've been kind of voting against kind of sections of the bill whilst it's in committee. We are serious about making sure
you know that
we are
because of the protest clauses.
Let her finish.
Tough. So we are being tough on crime. We're introducing this legislation, which is all about being tough on crime and having tougher sentences. And this is part of a whole range of different measures that this government are undertaking, both in terms of investment in terms of the criminal justice system, but also in terms we had the domestic abuse bill. We've got this bill which is going through Parliament in the moment. We've got a consultation in terms of victims bill. We're providing the investment, but we're also providing the legislation too.
Right, Amanda, does the Prime Minister care more about protecting statues than protecting women?
Absolutely not. And as I say, that this is why we're introducing all of these different measures to protect victims of sexual assault and also rape.
Down the road.
Right, well, hang on.
Kicking the can down the road. More reviews, no action.
Right, well, Sarah, let me just...
This is action. This is legislation which is making action, ensuring that we do protect victims of crime.
Right, it is important, though, to be clear about what is being discussed, isn't it, Sarah? Keir Starmer tweeted this back in March. We've showed it on the programme before. Attacking a statue equals 10 years in prison. Rape sentences equals 5 years in prison. Nothing on outlawing street harassment. Labour won't support the Conservatives' bill, which doesn't tackle violence against women and girls. This is the response from Robert Buckland, the Cabinet Secretary. Disappointing to see Keir Starmer misrepresent sentencing policy like this. The average sentence for rape is 9 years, 9 months, and the maximum is life. Our reforms will mean longer prison terms for sex offenders, but Labour is voting against them. Do you accept that he has been misleading in that tweet, the original one, because he wasn't comparing the average sentence for rape with the average sentence for criminal damage?
Absolutely not. I mean, you can talk about average sentences for as long as you like, but the bottom line is that there are rapists who are getting sentences that are 5 years and less. And that is not sending a message to victims that we are on their side and we are going to act. But let's be clear, the problem is so much wider than sentencing. The government fails at every point. The delays in the courts process mean that people have to wait years. And we introduced amendments yesterday just to make it easier for victims to give evidence, and the government rejected those as well. There's a whole raft of interventions, which is why we brought out our set of policies on violence against women and girls. We'd love to work with the government on implementing all of those things, but as the Victims Commissioner said this morning, kicking the can down the road, underwhelming response.
Well, Amanda Milling, away from sentencing, picking up on Sarah's point about the fact that most of these cases, because the number of cases reported of rape has gone up quite significantly, and yet they're not even making it to court, these prosecutions.
And this is why we've introduced this action plan. This is why we had the review, to understand where there were issues with the system. And so this action plan will enable us to ensure that the criminal justice system and all parts of it ensure that those cases are heard in court, and that we ensure that we get the justice for the victims, and also that those who perpetrated are punished. That's the whole purpose of this review and the action plan.
Right. I mean, Vicky, do you think this review is really going to change anything dramatically?
Well, it's hard to say, isn't it? I think the problem is, yes, talking about sentencing, but so many victims out there will say that that is not the issue. We're never getting to the point of sentencing. They're not even getting to the point of charging people. But I think if you've got the Justice Secretary having to apologise for this, and you've got the Prime Minister talking about it, and really saying to the police, this has got to change, you would think that eventually that filters down and becomes maybe a point where they realise that the culture has to change completely. So it won't happen quickly, but it clearly is getting to the point now where the government thinks it's more of a priority.
Right. Well, Boris Johnson, Amanda Milling, made reference to the difficulties in terms of gathering evidence, having to recover mobile phone records and data. And if you look at the figures for the Institute for Fiscal Studies, there have been something like 25% reduction in terms of resources to the Ministry of Justice since 2010. How much is down, straightforwardly, to money?
So one of the things you look at, if you look at the number of cases back between the 2010 and 2015 Parliament, there were more cases being prosecuted. But, it's not just about resource. We're making investments into all aspects of the criminal justice system at the moment, and that's from the police. And we had the manifesto commitment in terms of recruiting more police officers. We are delivering on that.
The ones you cut.
So we made a promise to recruit more police officers since the manifesto.
Making huge. We are making huge inroads.
This is also about. It's about.
Hang on, Sarah. Hang on. Don't cut
It's about investment in terms of the criminal justice system, but it's also about ensuring that we put legislation through to tackle all of these issues. And the Labour Party are voting against that legislation.
All right. Look, Robert Buckland, the Justice Secretary, has said that cuts may have contributed to the problems. But Sarah, in terms of what the Labour Party would do, can you commit now to restoring the cuts that have been made, 25% increase in funding?
Well, we're not going to announce the money until the election, but yes, we do want more resources, absolutely.
Well, hang on, you've been criticising Amanda Milling for cutting the police. Yes. So will you commit to putting back in that 25% of funding?
We'll commit to the money when we come to the election. But listen, we have an
What is Labour Party policy? What is their policy? We don't know.
We have an entire green paper, which is about a victims bill, introducing legal aid so that victims have wraparound support. We want to change the minimum sentencing for rape and for stalking. We want to introduce a harassment clause so that you can, like the French have, so that we outlaw street harassment and do something about it. We want to change our court system so that sexual abuse and violence is fast-tracked. We want to look at domestic abuse. But you won't
commit to whether you're going to invest more money.
We have an entire raft of policies, far more than anything the government has suggested in their rape review, which
we are undertaking so many different things.
Is underwhelming.
Hang on, ladies, don't cut across. Don't cut across each other. Lovely that you're having a conversation or a debate, but don't cut across each other because the viewers can't hear. Let me just put to you what Robert Buckland did say, the Justice Secretary, Amanda Milling. Obviously, I put the issue of funding there to Sarah, but the cuts, he said, were self-evidently part of the problem. Do you accept that?
So look, we are, resource is one thing, but we are making investment in all aspects of the criminal justice system. But it's also about kind of legislation. That's what we're doing. And the Labour Party keep voting against it.
All right. So, yes, you agree with Robert Buckland, or you don't, that money and resources are part of the problem?
And Robert's going to, set that out, and that is why we're making investment in terms of the criminal justice system, and also delivering on those manifesto commitments to get more police officers on our streets.
All right, we're going to move on. Vicky, we're going to talk about changing of staff or the guard within the Labour Party leader's office. What's happening?
Yeah, I mean, this is about the staff that work there. This is not about the shadow cabinet. It's not about the MPs and the people he wants to be shadowing ministers. This is about the people who have worked around him since he became leader. So that's Director of Communications, for example. It's the Chiefs of Staff. So there's been a bit of a change. Now, there are some in the Labour Party briefing that these are people really being sacked because they haven't done their job properly. And then there are other explanations in many cases for why these people might be moving on. There are personal reasons. There are other people who are moving to different jobs. But I think the broader picture here is that it doesn't feel like a totally happy ship. And I think that is the problem. There are lots of complaints you hear from Labour MPs. You know, let's face it, Labour backbenchers always like to have a bit of a complaint about the leader's office. There's always this disconnect. Now, they wouldn't say that it's as difficult or as fractious as it was under Jeremy Corbyn, but they still feel that they need to know more about the direction that the party is going in. And that is the criticism that is directed at Sir Keir Starmer, that he hasn't really shown what he believes, let alone whether he can take the party in that direction and achieve things.
Right. Well, this is the headline in The Guardian newspaper. Keir Starmer set to make major changes to Labour backroom team. Several long-time allies, including former MP Jenny Chapman, to move aside after by-election as leader seeks to shift into campaigning stance. Sarah, obviously, admission things aren't going well.
Well, I don't think it's anything on the scale of the psychodrama of Dominic Cummings. But look, I'm glad Jenny Chapman is going on to a front bench public facing role, actually, because she's going to be tackling the issues around Brexit, which we know the government have got into a complete mess with over Northern Ireland. And that is too fragile not to take seriously. So I am very glad that she's in that front facing role because she's absolutely brilliant.
Right, but you admit that in other areas it's not going well.
I'm not going to comment on people who work for somebody else and don't have a right of reply. But look, our job is to persuade the voters that we will keep them safe and we will give them opportunity. And that is what we are focused on doing. That's what we're doing in the by-elections. That's what we're doing across the board with our policy review. That's what I'm doing on crime, where, you know, the government's record is woeful. So we will fight as hard as we can to make a case that we can do better than this government, and we need to try and win the trust of the British public to do that.
Well, and when it comes to the voters, what changes will people notice? Will the public notice from these changes? They've obviously been done after the poor election results. What will we see?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the changes of
No, I'm not asking you to do the personnel, Sarah. I'm asking you what policy changes. What will look different to the voters from the Labour Party?
Over the summer, we will be out there. Keir will be out there talking to people. My brief in terms of crime, policing, antisocial
But there'll be no change in policy then?
Well, we've just announced a big policy review. We've also announced several significant policies, including on education, including on the environment, including on COVID, that we will be talking to people about across the country because we think they are the right approach. We want to keep people safe. We want to give people opportunity. And that's what we're trying to talk to the public about so that we can win their trust and get rid of this chaotic government.
Let's move on to this story in The Guardian, which says EU citizens in UK face 28-day notice if they miss settled status deadline. Actually, it was brought up at Prime Minister's Questions, Vicky, by Philippa Whitford, the SNP MP. What's the situation? The Prime Minister says millions have already signed up.
Yeah, I mean, this is all about protecting the rights and the status of EU citizens, people who have lived here for up to 5 years, have settled status, there's pre-settled status as well. So as long as you were here before December the 31st, you can apply for that as well. Now, let's say that the government, the Home Office in particular, has not got a great reputation when it comes to this kind of thing. But 5.6 million people have applied. Around 5 million have been granted the status. They have their rights protected, so they can have free NHS care, for example. They can still claim benefits. So many do see this as an enormous success. But of course, there are always going to be issues for people. There are still 400,000 who are waiting to hear what's going to happen to them. The deadline is next Wednesday, so there's one more week to go. But even after that, the message from the officials in the Home Office is very much we are trying to help people here. We're seeking people out who need to apply to make sure that they have the rights protected. They will continue to do that. So you get 28 days once they think that there's a problem and you should have applied. But they are going to be very generous, they say, when it comes to late applications, if there's a reasonable excuse.
Amanda Milling, should they extend that deadline, bearing in mind there is still such a sizable number of people who have yet to apply?
I think that, as the Prime Minister set out in PMQs just a little bit earlier on, it has been a huge success in terms of the number of people who have applied. And the key thing here is that the Home Office and government are encouraging people to come forward so that they can get that status. So,
right,
I think that's the key message from here.
I get the message, but should it be extended?
But this is, the Home Office are doing everything they can to reach out to anybody that does want to have settled status. And, that is a key message here. We just want people to come forward so that they can get that status.
Right. I mean, Vicky, do you think that's going to be considered?
I think the point here, which is very important to say, that if you have applied, if you're one of those 400,000, you will not lose any benefits in the meantime while you wait for that result. So that is the key thing. And I think the government, very mindful of what happened with Windrush, they don't want a repeat of that. That's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests. I will be back tomorrow at 12:15 with another edition of Politics Live. So please join me then. Bye-bye.